Ladies and gentlemen, what we're here to talk about this evening is thiomolybdate, an awful word which many people have difficulty in saying. But actually what we'd like to talk to you about tonight is thiomolybdate. It may be a new word to you, but it's what you may refer to in practice as secondary copper deficiency or copper lock. So I'd like to try and take you through this subject this evening. And what I'd like to ask, if it's all right with everybody, could we hold the questions till the end this evening for reasons which I'm sure are apparent to you. So if we'd like to get into the subject, Andy, please, that would be great. Probably a little bit about myself, just give you some idea. I think I've met one or two of you before over the years. But as Dennis very nicely said, I came over with the buyout of Telsalt into the Bimeda area. And basically, I've been with that company for about 12 or 14 years, really working with vets all around Europe and further afield in New Zealand and Mexico, some work in Canada, on this subject because it is one that interests me, and hopefully I can help you go through it tonight. And then you might be able to see a little bit more why we say we are very different in a mineral bolus and why we use the word unique. But that word bolus, I hope, can be explained to you very clearly tonight in why we're different from the other copper oxide products that are actually available on the market. One of the things I'm very keen on when I talk about this is that whilst we believe fully in our product and we know that it operates very well on farm because it's a registered product POM VPS and an LM as Cozy Cure in cattle, and in Ireland we're actually marketing Cozy Eye Cure, which is the same product ostensibly except with an add of iodine for obvious reasons here. But ladies and gentlemen, far be it from me to stand here and say that minerals are the be-all and end-all of fertility. So when I talk about fertility with people like yourself being practice vets, I need to have an understanding about how this cow ticks myself. I need to know her management by the people that look after her, her housing, environmental things are good for her. Forage is one that obviously interests me an awful lot because it's where, if you like, the problems of excessive molybdenum, which you deal with, excessive sulfur, which you understand, and iron is one I would bring into the discussion quite clearly. But I also need to know that these forages can supply the energy alongside other feeds and supply the protein alongside other feeds. So again, it would be wrong of me to be helping you diagnose problems in the term of not considering energy, protein and the cow's needs. But one area also which we spend a lot of time in trying to get people to diagnose is that of the drinking water of the cow, because that drinking water needs to be palatable, but it doesn't need to carry elements which are antagonistic to the cow. Again, that element of sulfur, hydrogen sulfide. So if you stick your nose in a private well and you smell rotten eggs, it could be, A, the cow isn't going to drink as much water as she should do for milk production, and secondly, it isn't going to help her in terms of sulfur coming into her rumen, combining with molybdenum and forming thiomolybdate. Iron is another issue in water, and sometimes manganese. The other issues that I would worry about are the bacterial side of that water, but perhaps that is a different discussion from tonight. Other areas, soil, and quite a lot when I've been over in Ireland, and I think some of you know I've been coming in and out of the country now on mineral nutrition for some 20 years. But people talk about soil and taking soil samples to understand what's in the green material over here, the forage. But please understand that soil mineral levels will not necessarily always mirror in the grass, particularly things like cobalt and selenium. However, we did touch on milk fever tonight when we were down in the bar, but potassium, generally, if it's high in soil, it will be high in the forage as well. So that is one of the things that does show through. But I always start with forage mineral analysis to give me a clue to the possible problems that we could see with cows, and particularly that area of molybdenum, sulfur and iron being issues. We spoke briefly about milk fever this evening. Excess potassium certainly doesn't help our milk fever issue. This is more your bag, ladies and gentlemen. Disease is the one that you deal with day in, day out, IBR, BVD, lepto. Why am I stressing these points? I think I made myself clear at the start of this slide. As a company, we wish to present our products to you to be used professionally and properly, and I also believe that we need to make sure that there will be other factors affecting fertility, but we want to make sure our product is used effectively and efficiently for everybody to see the benefits. So some time ago, I actually set about in the UK, when we were TELSOL, of talking to vets and farmers around the country of the need help navigating the mineral minefield. I'm not trying to say that I know more or that I'm any better than anybody else in the field, but if we look at this horrible ball of knitting here, which is known as Dyer's wheel, it's these elements that I deal with day in, day out when I'm dealing with farmers, trying to talk about the complexities of the things that we deal with. And what we're going to major on perhaps tonight will be sulfur, some iron over here, and molybdenum, as we've already said. But it is trying to understand what the cow is doing with these elements, and are they actually elements that are a problem in their own right. And I would like to suggest to you that they are, and they don't cause a secondary deficiency or a copper lockout. But before we go too deep into that one area, I think what I'd like to just have a look at is really trace element problems as we see them. And generally in the field, we don't see the elements necessarily always being deficiency. They can be, if you like, to a degree locked up. And one of the areas I perhaps give as an explanation would be if we have a lot of sulfur in the forages and in the total diet, it can be a problem where selenium is, shall we say, under pressure. So the real reason behind this is that sulfur becomes very aggressive in the animal system, and selenium cannot get through the similar pathways that sulfur is using. So we can have problems like that we can see. We are experiencing on the UK mainland copper toxicity. Probably have 2 or 3 cases that I'm dealing with at the moment. That's because copper is being overfed, I think, because of the confusion about what molybdenum and sulfur actually does with the animal. We've already stated the interactions that we see of the elements which are important, and there are some 16 or 18 elements which are actually important for bovine and ovine mineral nutrition. So what we've tried to do, my colleague that I work with in a laboratory that looks at thiamolidate toxicity, we presented at BCVA 18 months ago or 2 years ago, and what we were doing was trying to sort of classify. So deficiency elements that we see quite commonly within replacement heifers, yearlings, within beef cattle, within suckler cows, selenium, iodine, manganese, cobalt, zinc. You hear that I didn't say then in dairy cattle. What we're clearly seeing that the dairy cattle in the UK, and I don't have too much data for Irish farms, is that we are starting to see some of these elements become toxic, and selenium is one of them that we think we're beginning to overfeed. So excessive elements that causes problems in other areas, I've already mentioned these: iron, sulfur and molybdenum. Aluminium is an interesting one, just coming back to that subject of milk fever. Why? Because when it becomes aggressive, it has the ability to actually block the utilization of phosphorus to some degree. Again, can be connected with milk fever issues. And I've already mentioned selenium. But I think one of the problems that we suffer from in terms of trace element mineral nutrition in the industry is that I think we'd all agree through the room that the word deficiency is actually very easy to deal with. It is that we do not meet the animal's need for the elements that she requires. So I think we can park that quite easily. In the far side of the graph, we're looking at toxicity, and that really means that we're possibly overfeeding the animal but causing death as well. And some of the complications we deal with, if we look at the textbooks, we can see that overfeeding of iodine actually brings the signs of deficiency, although it is actually toxicity that you're dealing with. So the natural thing may be to put more in because we think the symptoms are telling us that it's deficient. Really, it's around halfway that we want to be. We want to get adequate levels. And so some of us are trying desperately to get more and more data from bloods, from livers, from animals to really where these reference levels lie. Because looking into it, I think the data sets are quite weak. And then going on a little bit deeper into the importance of mineral nutrition in a very general area, you can see here the major elements, calcium down to sodium. Obviously those are important, and I would suggest some of the milk fever problems we're seeing are obviously tied up with calcium, magnesium and potassium that we've already spoken about this evening. Sodium may have a role here. I've also got my trace elements down here that we can look at, and obviously in Cozy Eye Cure we are supplying copper, but in a very different form to other boluses. We are supplying cobalt, iodine and selenium in Cozy Eye Cure, but I come back to highlight my 3 pet areas of molybdenum, iron and sulfur. And it's those that we'll start going into a little deeper in a minute when we just looked at some more issues to do with mineral nutrition. What we're really just trying to put some background here is the mineral problems that we know can be attributed to some of the areas that we see in cows. We've spoken about milk fever, so we'll hop over that. Grass staggers, we know, connected to magnesium and potassium issues. Edema connected with sodium potassium excess in the body. Perhaps something you may not deal with too much here, but I suppose it's this area here, these retained placentas, extended calvings, and in my area, poor conception rates is one that I'm interested in. And can this be attributed to iron, molybdenum and sulfur? And my view is that certainly this area here, those last three comments, are definitely attributed to these areas here. The other confusion that we have in mineral nutrition, we sometimes have farmers complaining about retained placenta, and people jump to this selenium iodine area where it could well be a milk fever problem or a subclinical milk fever problem. So again, it's trying to put diagnostics together and end up with the right answer for the benefit of yourselves and your farmer clients. So again, we're looking at these areas of problems. Stillborn weak kids, it should actually read calves, but it's something I was doing for a group of goat people not long ago. And in terms of what we're looking at here, iodine, selenium, this stillborn weak kids, abortion problems with calves, but again, there are very other issues that can come into here getting this right. The industry is now coming under great pressure where we can't feed so much cobalt as we think the animal needs. So we're having to look at vitamin B12 in mineral specifications more and more now to try and help the rumen function of that. But again, we come back to this area of anestrus, poor cows, conception rates, and I would like to suggest by the end of the evening your mind may be a little bit more open that this is a problem to your nutrition area. So basically homing into this area, these mineral elements which we find to be antagonistic, I think that we mustn't lose sight of iron as a mineral to how aggressive it can be. We know that it's coming into the animal as background, so that's added in crops. Even in some of the minerals that you'll be buying and purchasing, there will always be iron in these minerals. So my argument is that we probably don't need to add actual iron to many of the mineral specifications that we see, unless we're on 100% maize diets, which can be fed, or if we're on straw-based diets. So iron is becoming an issue, and it makes the sulfur-molybdenum triangle even harder to overcome because it is removing, in essence, some of the copper that we're feeding into the animal. So this word thiamolidate, which I'm spending a lot of time remembering how to spell myself and also actually getting people to pronounce it, and it probably took me a good 6 months. But where we are with this is thiamolidate, very simply being thio, elements of sulfur, here we go, molybdate being molybdenum. And what we see here is that we now know from reference and the research work that is taking place that this is combining in the rumen from molybdenum and sulfur and causing thiamolidate to enter blood and be a problem in its own right. The problem you will have as veterinary clinicians is that unfortunately the outward signs of thiamolidate toxicity you'll see in a minute are very similar to that of those that are quoted as copper deficiency. So thiamolidate, as I've already said, is made more difficult to deal with in the presence of iron within the rumen. Okay, so coming back to Dyer's wheel and just highlighting the clear connection here between sulfur and molybdenum and where it can form within Dyer's wheel and why iron is an issue as well. But I think before we go too far and too deep into this evening, I thought I'd like to put in a little graph to say, where is this molybdenum coming from? What actually affects molybdenum transfer from the soil? Here on the bottom axis we have pH being strongly acid and out here being strongly alkaline. And you can see that as we move our pH level up by perhaps applying lime or other substances to the soil to correct pH, molybdenum becomes more freely available. And what you'll find, even if you have small amounts of molybdenum registered in soil, you'll actually move the pH and then the molybdenum will move very freely and quickly, and it doesn't really matter the amount that's in the soil. We can move up then to see sulfur. This is interesting because many soils, when you test them, actually are probably a little bit deficient within sulfur. So our fertilizer colleagues will say, actually, gentlemen, ladies, we think that you need to put more sulfur on to help the crop. That could be a very good point. However, Is it too much, and does it make this molybdenum problem worse to deal with? Because we have a very bad habit of thinking of the soil, applying fertilizer to it. We have a bad habit of thinking that the grass needs that, but we don't think about the chemical attributes of the grass and how it affects the cow. It's all about growing grass for the right reasons, but not necessarily thinking about the ruminant. Iron in it as an element is an interesting thing to deal with, because it's really saying down here that it likes that more acid condition, which is very true. But however, if we get compaction of soil and fields, iron will actually move into the 4 or 5 inches in the root zones, and crops will literally uptake iron into them. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So just to bring this side of it to some conclusion, mineral levels in grass on the left-hand side of the axis. Down the bottom of the graph, we're actually looking at increased liming, which may or may not be happening so much these days. Certainly more restrictions on the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium that we're using. But in general, where we increase these elements, we do see the levels of molybdenum and sulfur climbing, and certainly iron for compaction reasons. Our levels of copper are actually holding about static within forage mineral reports, and we're still seeing decreases in cobalt, manganese and zinc in forages, particularly cobalt, in that the soil has a known need for cobalt, but grass, green forage and protein doesn't. So the plant doesn't tend to take it up, yet we do need it for very young animals, and also production of other major functions like glucose within the animal. So I think I've already said this, but just to drive the points home, where are we seeing these elements coming from? Livestock drinking water becoming more common because of borehole waters being used on farm to actually let cows drink. I'd never recommend using borehole water for circulation cleaning. And some of the things that you will see if you're in the dairy, just scrubbing up, tap running, nice dark marks down the back of the wall on the floor, is an indication perhaps that these waters are carrying too much iron, and sulfur you'll smell anyway. So you can just see some telltale tips within parlours where these things are a problem. Forages and proteins will carry iron always. All forages, all proteins will carry sulfur. So we have to think about not just the pasture, but if we're feeding soybean meal, that's actually got about 2.53 milligrams of molybdenum for every kilo. So we must look at that as well. So it's not just coming out of the forages, and obviously this molybdenum area here coming in from protein. I've already mentioned that some premixes have a lot of iron added into it. Again, for the life of me, I don't understand particularly why nutritionally people are doing this. The more older people within the industry in terms of selling mineral always used to feel that iron needed to be added to make the mineral look a good colour and a rich red, so farmers might think it's quality. That's the only one I've been able to listen to. Personally, I just don't add it. So what can we do at veterinary level, and to also guide our farmers into some area of understanding about where this molybdenum and sulfur is coming from? Here, presented by Thompson & Joseph Limited, is actually a forage grazing analysis which was taken from a farm about half a mile from where I live in Cirencester, Gloucestershire. For those of you go to Cheltenham racing, you look up a hill, and I live just the other side of that hill. But what is interesting here is that this was actually a sheep problem, and this guy was really seeing sheep scouring all the time, yet we knew that worms were clear. This guy was then getting some sway back. So here we have a pasture saying 5.5 of molybdenum. It's got a sulfur level in it of 0.23, and this hasn't seen fertilizer for a long time. The iron level here isn't actually over bad, but this molybdenum and sulfur is a problem to these animals. We've done diagnostics with blood. Now this guy is using Cozy Cure sheep. So this is actually a very inexpensive way to look at the forage, and not only is it giving you information about our interest of molybdenum and sulfur and iron, it also starts to say, well, actually the potassium is at 3.59, and that's more than enough for a dairy cow to possibly be in problems with milk fever at this time of year. So these samples can be taken actually when the silage is made, because it isn't going to change. We can be well in front of ourselves with some information and talking to our clients about the possibility of a milk fever issue, grass staggers, an issue around thymolidate. And here, just to, as one or two have asked this evening, we have a cation exchange at 572. The red line is telling me, have a chat with your client about the possibility of milk fever. I wouldn't feed if that was a silage on its own. It would worry me. So we have good information in the field that we can utilise quite easily there. Again, by the same company, Thompson Joseph Limited, a full water analysis looking at pH of the water, looking at alkalinity, acidity of the water, looking at nitrate, nitrogen and ammonia, because these three areas here can also have an effect on fertility. Here the sulfur level, which I'm interested in, is at 137, and actually when you multiply that in, that is actually at an area which can be issues in raising the level of total sulfur consumed by the cow and heading towards this molybdenum thymolidate issue. Okay, so we've mentioned this already in my opening words to you this evening, this terminology that we use as mineral nutritionists, as vets. I'm not trying to say you're wrong, but this can be an interesting discussion. I've already said that copper deficiency is actually a lack of copper. We don't meet the animal's need. And in secondary copper deficiency, I'm actually saying I don't think it occurs in the sense that you may feel it does. So what I'm saying here is secondary copper deficiency should read thymolidate toxicity. Copper lock, same descriptive term. I don't really think it exists in the sense that it's been explained in the textbooks in the past, and we need to have a fresh look at where we're going with this. So thymolidate toxicity, we know it exists. Cozy Cure through Bimetatalsol has been designed to overcome these problems, and we'll look into this a little bit further now. Copper deficiency, in terms of where we are, should give us low copper bloods and low liver levels. So in terms of that, we should very simply say we have deficiency if we're doing standard veterinary work to establish that deficiency. But if we look a little bit further, and I've mentioned this already this evening, actually some of our cows and cattle may well be giving us some interesting messages. But if we look around the picture here, these cows up in Orkney, we knew that their copper bloods were fine. We managed to get some liver out of some of them as well, and we could see that there were no issues on copper. So straight away we started to look at the levels of molybdenum and sulfur and iron, and we started to build a picture for the client. Here, these are actually Irish weanlings. They're on a farm just outside Fermoy. The veterinary surgeon that upon that practice I've been working with for a long time, and these problems that they see, they felt was a copper problem, so they started putting a lot of copper into the dry cow. That didn't work. We investigated and found that molybdenum and sulfur and iron were a problem to them in this brown cast. The dairy cow here, the same thing. And this Irish cow down right in southwest Scotland was taken some years ago, but this panda eye appearance, which the textbooks indicate a copper issue, and I'm clearly saying that these cows were having more than enough copper in the diet, yet we still saw this foxy brown coat. And really, as my colleague Neville Suttle states, it isn't a sign of copper deficiency. There is something else going on. What we now know from the research that has been carried out now since the late 80s is that when thymolidate forms and gets into the body as a problem in its own right, it is actually causing a lack of oestrus through LH and FSH problems. We can see reabsorption problems with embryos. Also, the other interesting one is this cytochromase C oxidase. What we're actually seeing here is thymolidate grabbing the copper, in very simple terms, that keeps this oxidase cytochromase active and reducing its ability to work properly. So the energy going in is not necessarily being metabolized to its 100% effective level, and we see a reduced milk yield because of this. Again, this foxy brown coat, we know that thymolidate is capable of switching off triosinase, which is connected to melamine production, and this is why we see these animals going brown in the coat. I do accept there are other reasons for brown coats as well. Just some pictures that we've used over the years now just to demonstrate those clinical symptoms that we talk about with farmers. Is this copper deficiency? No, it isn't. We think it is a thymolidate issue with these stock. More of a system that you are interested here where you're very much more grass-based than some of the herds I deal with back in the UK. So my colleague Neville Suttle, who is one of the gurus in copper work in the United Kingdom and perhaps the world, there are probably three people I think that have a lot to say about this, is Neville Suttle, Dr. Stuart Telford, the ex-owner of Telsol Limited, and also a guy called Neville Grace, who is a lecturer in mineral nutrition at Massey down in New Zealand. But this is some of the complication that we see, this foxy brown coat being taken by many people as deficiency when clearly we don't think it is. And certainly Neville and I very much agree on those points. This one, an interesting case, was a cow I took a picture of in Mexico some time ago. But these herd managers down in Mexico, probably running, 5, 6, 7,000 cows, putting a massive amount of copper into these cows and not getting the results that they should have been, because they felt that the molybdenum coming from alfalfa, the sulfur coming from alfalfa, molybdenum coming from things like soybean, were actually giving them what they thought was a deficiency and ended up killing cows. We went to Mexico to look at the problems, to see what they've done. They are now starting encouraging use of Cozy Cure down there alongside other copper supplementation, all within legal levels. So we have the statement that says it isn't copper deficiency in my mind, ladies and gentlemen, though the clinical symptoms appear to the animal to be the same. So we have this word, a conundrum, if you like, of what are we dealing with and how can we overcome it. So the problem that we're speaking about this evening is molybdenum and sulfur, drilling into it deeper, which forms the thymolidate, which we want to capture by the use of the unique copper form in Cozy Cure. So if we go back in years now to about 1987, Filippo and his co-workers up in the Morden and Aberdeen started to look at the effect of iron and molybdenum alone on plasma copper concentration levels here in blood. And one of the things, just please remember, this is plasma and not serum. So what we had here is a control diet. Then they started to add in iron and molybdenum, and you can see that this iron and molybdenum effect had quite a considerable pushback down on the blood levels that were being seen in these animals. So they started to understand that certain elements did have an issue, but weren't sure at this stage why this was happening. And perhaps as we go forward, hopefully I can get your interest level and think about why this is happening. So again, we looked at dietary molybdenum and iron on peak effects of LH concentrations after LHR therapy in heifers. And what we saw here were the controls working quite nicely. But when we started putting iron and molybdenum in, these LH concentrations really started to fall. And again, I don't think people really understood. It wasn't really the depression of copper that was causing it. It was actually molybdenum and iron. And then when they got their head round sulfur, understanding that the thymolidate was causing a problem in its own right in the body. The other one that we've looked at is the molybdenum and iron on conception rates in heifers, and this was a very interesting trial, and if I could replicate it again and take it further, I'd love to, is we have conception rates here up at an 80 level, but when we start to add in iron and molybdenum, you can see these conception rates fall right off. And this is where people started to really ask what molybdenum was doing and what iron was doing in the rumen. And then when we start to replete them back up, you can see that if we wash away these elements, our conception rates start to improve again greatly. Bringing some, shall we say, slightly fresher research into play, Claire Williams and Sandy McKenzie from Harper Adams started to look at the effect of molybdenum and iron accumulating in the pituitary gland. And you can see the pituitary gland staining here on the control is quite clear, quite happy. But when Sandy and Claire started to put in iron on its own, there were some areas of discoloration and thinking that there are problems going on with the pituitary. But when they started to add molybdenum in, these are the things that they started to see. And this was done in sheep. And really what we're saying is that we know that thymolidate is getting into the pituitary gland and has the ability to deactivate the copper that is starting to spark the signals that they need to get signals of LHRH into the animal and getting the animal cycling. This unfortunately is still unpublished work because Claire went down with cancer while she was doing this trial work. One of the things I'm sometimes asked is, well, how much molybdenum, how much sulfur, how much iron is a problem, Pete? Well, generally speaking, what we're actually seeing is iron over 150 milligrams in the kilo dry matter, about 0.15% of sulfur, and about 0.05 of molybdenum. So we're actually now dealing in the field with less molybdenum and less sulfur being more of a problem than we thought it was. So schematically, what we've tried to do is take you through a set of slides where to give you an idea of what we understand is going on. So obviously we've got a schematic rumen here, and this is really where all the action happens. Coming back to refer to my forage mineral reports, some people will have you believe that the copper is locked in the crop before it even gets into the animal. This is not the case. So we have here this schematic, and what we have up here on the left-hand side, what I refer to as munchy men, but really it is molybdenum and sulfur. And what we're saying is that these come into diet from the areas that we've already discussed, and they form a compound, as we've already discussed, called thiamolidate. So we have these little devils in the rumen now, and they're floating around the rumen as thiamolidate. So here we have the situation of the little munchy men, and really they're quite hungry for copper. So they actually start joining together. And when we have this joining together, what we see is now that that copper is joined with this thiamolidate and is actually make it an inert. So it will go out of the system with no problem at all. It can't go through a rumen wall because it's now too big a molecule to get out. So this is a good situation to have. But we've got some munchy men here that have not found copper. So if they do find copper, everything is great, and they can go out through the back door and basically end up on the floor giving no problem at all. But if we get to the next slide, what we start to see are the munchy men actually getting copper. If we go again, they actually go walkabout now through the rumen wall because they have not found copper to satisfy them. And at this stage, what we're actually trying to do with CozyCure is supply copper here to bind with these in the rumen and stop them being a problem. But if they get into blood, this is where they start to do their damage as thiamolidate in the blood system against the animal's copper metallosystem. And that is a big problem. So if we get this happening, we need to go further forward and take in the next slide. We have then, as I've said, now got all these ones going negative, and we've got all these actually looking for copper in the system. So the problem that we have to just stop and think about at the moment is that the more iron there is in the diet, it actually depresses the copper coming in from other areas and then makes that thiamolidate available for the animal to use. So we must think about what we're trying to do to stop that thiamolidate, and do we get any problems with clinical copper deficiency at this stage with all that iron being reacted in the rumen? So why is molybdenum toxic in the level at lower levels than we actually think it should be? It's basically because iron is in the diet and it's having a very negative effect in what we call stage 1. So we come back to here with the elements actually being connected. That's good, but we've still got them in the blood looking for things, and that's poor. But what we have happening here now is iron coming into the diet in the first stage. We also have sulfur coming in, and what that element is capable of doing is actually seeing sulfur and iron binding together. As it binds together, it also attracts copper itself. So that stage 1 is a very important stage, but a negative stage, because it's decreasing the amount of available copper for the animal to bind with molybdenum. So that's what we think iron is doing at this stage. So what we're trying to do in terms of a product like CozyCure, which I see as a treatment to a problem, not a supplement, is that we have a glass-based bolus, which is a total glass product, and its ability is to stay within the rumen reticulum and supply ionic copper, Cu2, which has a great affinity for molybdenum and sulfur. So what we're trying to do is use this as a treatment in the rumen to block molybdenum and sulfur to stop it getting into the body. Other copper elements are going to be fed to do this, but when that copper element is fed, I think it's quite important that it's fed not at an overage rate, so you're not putting too much copper in, and it needs to be things like a little bit of copper sulfate, possibly copper carbonate, and copper acetate, particularly acetate because we know that to be very rumen effective as well. So you can use CozyCure quite safely alongside other copper supplements. So here we see that being nicely trapped up, and these thiamolidate munchy men basically being detoxified and they're not going to go anywhere. So again, coming back to what I'm saying, Cozy Cure as a treatment, applying ionic copper. To the best of my knowledge, no other bolus in the world supplies copper in the same way as Cozy Cure. So if we just hold here a minute and try and explain what I've just said, we're putting ionic copper into the rumen as Cozy Cure, and it's doing this complete action, this treatment. Other boluses that are available on the market, nothing wrong with the products. However, their copper comes into the rumen as copper oxide, and it has to get away from the rumen where the pH is about 6.7, 6.8. And when it gets away, it goes in little rods into the abomasal area where the pH is around about 2.2, and it becomes copper which is available to the animal here. So this is the big difference between Cozy Cure supplying the copper in ionic form to bind with molybdenum and stop it doing damage in the rumen, against other products which have little or no effect on thiamolidate at all. So that's basically where we are with thiamolidate, in my opinion. We've done some recent work. My colleague Nigel Kendall at Nottingham University and Claire Gould did some work looking at the references about thiamolidate, clearly showing on a peer-reviewed paper that thiamolidate does exist, it is a problem, and it is transferable across the rumen wall into blood, where it definitely does damage in its own right. And this was the role of rumen copper and thiamolidate absorption, which is freely available. One of the problems, ladies and gentlemen, that we get with thiamolidate toxicity is tied up, if you like, with the problems that you see of a clinical copper deficiency, or is it thiamolidate, as we've been discussing. A very good friend of mine, Mike Kirby, who's a vet at Delaware Vet Group in Somerset, which you keep seeing on the news at the moment, having a big problem with too much water, has had some problems on farm where we thought we had copper toxicity. So if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, this actually looks at liver biopsy levels, which Mike took. The UK reference range is 300 low, 8,000 high, yet our livers were reporting back it's 16,000 and 27,000, 13,000 and 2,000 odd. So from that, Mike and I were not very happy because we were worried about toxicity here, here and here. Our plasmas at the same time out of the same cows look okay, within range, 9 to 19. But over on the right-hand side of this blood set, all done at the same laboratory, we have a way of indirectly trying to confirm thiamolidate toxicity. And we're looking at a plasma, seroplasma, plasma copper ratio. And what we had with this herd of cows was clearly animals being very copper sufficient, but at the same time, they are suffering with thiamolidate toxicity. So we have this level of 1 and 1.5. I'm happy to say that's thiamolidate toxicity. We also have superoxidase dismutase, a copper codependent enzyme, which will be depressed for two reasons. One, a lack of copper going in the diet, which there clearly has not been, or the presence of thiamolidate. So at this sort of level of 11, 15, I'd expect this to be about 2,500 and this one to be about 3 to 3,500. So again, that's expressing a problem with thiamolidate toxicity within the animal. So basically, when Telsol Limited started looking at the product, we needed to be able to say to vets, can we actually analyse for thiamolidate? The answer is yes, we can, but it's an indirect test, so we hope that we can help you with things like that. And what we're seeing within the Leeds or Nottingham blood tests, and these are all done at Nottingham now, are clear indications that about 62% of all UK animals going through that lab have a problem with thiamolidate toxicity at any one time within their lives. So it's an interesting thing to look at, and we're also seeing a clear indication that most dairy cows are nowhere near copper deficient. So I would close up this evening by saying I hope that I've been able to talk to you a little bit about copper deficiency, about thiamolidate, and trying to get you to think a little bit about what thiamolidate is and perhaps accepting that this area is not as simple as we'd like it to be, but we do see it as a real problem, and understanding that Cozy Cure as a range on the copper side of its boluses were actually brought into this world to overcome this problem by research and science. So I'd like to draw that to a close for this evening. I hope you found it interesting, and I'd invite any questions from the floor. Thank you.
Sorry, Jan, stepped out, but he'll be able to tell you again. One-on-one next week in your practice.
Yeah. Okay. You say there isn't secondary copper deficiency,
Yes, sir.
which we were all told.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Excess molybdenum.
Yeah.
But then, like the quickest way of getting rid of the copper symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
you know, mousy red coat,
Yeah.
is just straight copper sulfate, orally.
Right.
So how do you marry that into
Right.
the reaction of sulfur,
Yeah. Okay.
iron, molybdenum, all combining together?
Right. I think probably what you'll find is if you're orally drenching with copper sulfate, that you will see a reaction, but it will only last for about 3 to 4 weeks in the cow of its effectiveness and its efficiency. So I'm quite happy to agree with what you're saying, that it will work, but it will only be for a short period. But what we're trying to do with the glass bolus is actually put the copper into the rumen for a period of up to 6 months, for 24/7, as they say. So I agree with what you're saying, it can do that. But the other thing that I worry about using copper as copper sulfate is sometimes the disassociation of the sulfur, where we may already have a sulfur issue in the animal.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I just want to bring it back to basics.
Yeah.
Basics. When I was going to college, it was all about molybdenum-induced copper deficiency,
Yeah.
manganese-induced cobalt deficiency.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Keep it simple,
Yeah.
stupid now. Call
No.
it what you will.
No, it's fine.
It's what you were trying to say there. You know, we were taught that molybdenum and sulfur interfered with the uptake of copper in the grass, between the soil and the herbage. And what you're saying there is that the molybdenum and the sulfur and the iron are interfering with the uptake of copper from the rumen into the...
Yeah. Basically, that's it. Yeah.
You know?
I would kick into touch the soil forage side and say that that doesn't have an issue until it gets into the rumen. And that's where the problem starts.
So really and truly, where you have land that is molybdenum-induced copper deficiency exists, that you're wasting your time treating with copper.
You're wasting your time bluntly treating with some forms of copper.
And what about the old injectable form?
Right, injectable copper, is that still available in the Irish market? Injectable copper?
Well, some of them
Yeah.
have come and gone.
Come and gone. Okay, if you're going to use an injectable copper subcut, particularly something like the old Copperite or Copperin, then they would be actually very effective at moving away the molybdenum and sulfur as thymolidate in blood for about a period of 3 to 4 weeks. So if you were very cute about when animals come into season and you want to breed them, then that could well work for you. But again, it's a very short window, exactly the same as your colleague is asking about putting that in. Yeah, so I, again, agree with you that that does work if you could get it, but it's very time specific.
Yeah. Wax fruit, particularly
Yeah.
the strong glands of wax fruit,
Yeah.
is very important in that. And do you know where we say take a dairy cow?
Mhm.
If you put a dairy cow on a completely copper deficient diet,
Mhm.
okay, and you do serum samples for copper, you will get normal serum samples for 6 months,
Mhm.
even though
Mhm.
we are massively high in molybdenum.
Mhm.
So your molybdenum should be taking the copper. If there is no copper going into the rumen,
Mhm.
under your scenario, the molybdate,
Yeah,
whatever you
sure.
call it,
Yeah.
go out and take copper from the rest
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
the cow,
Mhm.
presuming it did other millions.
Mhm.
How come that doesn't happen?
I think probably what you're looking at is just molybdenum on its own in the question that you're asking me.
But no,
Yeah.
because we have very high sulfur levels
Yes.
and consequently very low selenium.
Okay. Yeah.
So much so that there's a special selenium bolus by a certain company
Right.
called Wexford.
Okay.
Wexford selenium.
Okay.
Because of the stublands, okay?
Right, yeah.
So it's very...
Yeah, interesting.
So it's not selenium on its
Okay,
own.
right.
Or it's not molybdenum on its
No,
own.
no. So I think just repeating your question back, what you're saying is if you have forages which the animals are consuming, which have very high levels of molybdenum, and also then there is some background copper coming in because there's going to be natural copper there at some stage. So where you just get molybdenum coming in on its own, I think we run into issues called molybdenosis, which is probably a very different thing to that of thymolidate toxicity. So I would deal with it in a very different way perhaps than I would a thymolidate issue. And that's something we deal with on the wetlands of Somerset really. So I think it may be molybdenosis that you're dealing with. But I'll take that one offline if I may later on. I'll have a chat with you about that. So have any other questions, guys, or have I actually really confused you this evening? Sorry.
Is that little circle with all the triangles?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
so complex.
I know.
Yeah. We're only scratching the surface.
We are, I'm afraid. But I think we know what we know, and it is a difficult subject to get your head round, but it's asking you to just think a little bit more about what molybdenum and sulfur is doing, that it is doing harm in its own right, and it isn't just as easy as chucking copper in. Yeah. So that's really where I would go. That. Yeah. Yeah. No. That's fine.
But I'm just
Yeah.
trying to rationalise it
Yeah.
in my own head, so
Yeah.
I can talk to some farmers.
I know, and it is a difficult subject to discuss, but once it clicks, it is actually reasonably easy to discuss. There are some ways that I was doing it today that I'll talk to you about later on if you like. But one of the things I'd end up by saying before we close completely...
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I come at this from a pretty layman's point of view. I'm not read or anything like that. But you've been working with this product for nearly 15 years in the UK. Are there any sort of case examples you'd give of farmers and vets
Yes.
who are struggling with these kinds of issues where the use of the product, or what kind of impact did it have, and do they use it forever? Do they use it once a year?
Right.
Do they use it once and then in 3 years' time? Or what's it like?
Okay. In terms of what Ian is asking, so you've got situations where vets themselves have taken interest in the products and interest in the diagnosis, and we've seen areas where we've been able to be remarkably improve fertility when we've got into this. There's a paper published by David Black which shows far greater conception rates by using Cozy Cure than other products. In terms of its usage on farm, then some UK dairy herds are actually bolusing 3 times a year. So they're actually going every 4 to 5 months. Mainly because they know that they can defend the animal from the molybdenum and sulfur by having the ionic copper. Also there's selenium, iodine, etc. in it. So the impact on some farms has been great, Ian. I've got some farmers that will talk to me about, Pete, we may well change things, but we wouldn't stop using Cozy Cure. Because when they have, they've seen situations of the productivity and the fertility of the animal going back downhill. On the sheep side of life, we've recently had some independent trial work done by Elm Northumbria, a vet group in Northumbria in England, where they took Cozy Cure sheep and Cozy Cure lamb as the most expensive in the marketplace, but the return was absolutely fantastic, and I was going through that trial with Andrew tonight, because what we're doing as elements is supplying elements in a form into the rumen that the animal can use. If you think about the way that Cozy Cure was developed by the people that it was developed by, what we want is to put a product on the market that works, delivers the elements, and have a positive outcome for the clients. So the impact on many farms, Ian, is great. It is actually very important to them. Farms that will not farm without Cozy Cure. There are other things that we could go into that. So we've got that trial, we've got David Black's work, we've got work in New Zealand showing the same things as well, where these things are real issues to New Zealand farmers as well. The application tends to be, in the Irish market, very much it drying off. There are other options probably just around calving or at calving, options for yearlings and heifers as well. So there's plenty of options to go at. While we're on that subject, the one thing that I do need to stress to you is when you get this product, it comes in a foil. I won't open this one, but the reason it needs to come into a foil is the product does not like being in the open air very long. It then comes in a tray like this, and this is the actual bolus. So if you've not seen them before, this is the product that you're actually looking at. If you were actually to take that and smash it across a ploughshare, that is a solid piece of glass. I won't do it in this room this evening. But when you do use them, actually at the moment when I first gave them to you, they're slightly cool to the touch. When you administer these products, they must go down at hand heat. Okay, and that's written all over the boxes because they can be temperature affected. So they just need to be held in the hand or in a pair of overalls, and away you go. And that's all you need to remember about giving these to the product. The bolus gun itself is a New Zealand made product, 2 boluses, one after the other, rather than having to go back in twice, as animals don't like being bolused too much. And that delivers the bolus cleanly at the back of the throat. So application, probably here the common area. Andrew would tell you more because he's here all the time working with it, but probably at drying off is the area to go for. Trying to protect the animal through that area where eggs and things are being produced, and then secondly having the ability and the efficacy to go on into the early lactation and into the breeding season. So that's where we are.
So you asked a bit about the temperature.
Yeah.
You need to have them warmed up for the temperature?
Yeah, basically one of the ways you could do it is first of all take them out of the packing completely, put them into say a plastic pail with the number of boluses you need the night before. That's what I do when I'm bolusing. Generally line that pail with a bit of newspaper, keep them in a warm room, and then if you're outside bolusing, obviously I know that the temperature can be affected then, is I just keep them in my overall pockets, and that is enough just to keep them at blood temperature or hand temperature, about 16, 15 degrees. You don't want to warm them in pails of hot water. You don't want to put them in microwaves because you don't want to be in the room when they come out the front door. And that's how we do them. If not, I was bolusing a couple of weeks ago with a guy, and all we did was just put them in the well of a Land Rover or a 4x4 with the engine running with the blower on, and that is happy.
But if they're not warmed up when you administer them,
yes.
what's the effect?
The effect is that what can happen is that when they go into a warm rumen, is that you can get little fissures opening up, so it's a little hairline split, and unfortunately the rumen liquor gets into it. It allows the bolus then to become lighter quicker, and it's a possible regurgitation. I've only dealt with 4 regurgitation problems in the last 8 years on this type of product. As long as you follow the instructions, you'll be fine, but it's when you don't follow what's on the label. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen?
And, going back to the thiomolybdenate,
Yep.
Are you only advocating using them where you have a molybdenum problem?
No, the product is actually registered in the UK POM, VPS and LM here as Cozy Cure, and it is registered to fight the problem of thiomolybdenate and rectify deficiency. So no, it doesn't have to be just a problem farm.
So why should you use it in a farm where there's no molybdenum?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that many farms, from my experience, do have issues with molybdenum and sulfur somewhere along the way, if they're feeding protein. But if the other farms are there and perhaps they're not going to be feeding mineral all the time, and then you're looking at things like selenium and you're looking at iodine, so it is also giving the selenium iodine benefit, and many people tell me in Ireland that iodine is also a major issue to them. So you've got not just the copper, it can supply iodine, cobalt, copper, selenium as well. So you do have that range.
Cobalt, no?
Cobalt, yes. Yeah. As well.
Is that the reason why it gives the good result in sheep?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cobalt available in the rumen at a very young age. We can go in with a small baby bolus at about 6 to 8 weeks, as long as the breed can take it, and that's the reason that it's working. Because it's an available cobalt, helping the synthesis, getting rumen function working. You know the reasons as well as I do, and that's why it works.